evening. Come on, you usually say hi to me. Good evening. Thank you. Wow, I think I actually got a wave out of that one. That was pretty good. Thank you again for coming out. This is our 2009 Waterloo Catholic District School Board lecture tonight featuring Dr. Carolyn Whitney-Brown. I was feeling pretty bad about all those January evil lectures, so I prayed for spring. And I hope you like it, because I got it. Thank you. It helps to be well connected. I didn't do it all on my own. I want to admit that. Just a few quick announcements before we begin the evening. As always in our lobby, you will find that the Social Justice Committee of the University Catholic Community is selling fairly traded organic coffee, chocolate, and tea. So don't forget to stock up. Our sign-up sheet for our email list is out there, too. We send email reminders for events and news related to the Center for Responsible Citizenship, so please get your name on that if you haven't already done so. We also have a representative from Wordsworth Books who's got Carolyn's books and also some other relevant copies of books that you might find interesting. So have a look at those. And finally, we also have some pamphlets out here at the left-hand side on L'Arche's secondary school educational materials on the vision of Jean Vanier. So if that's something that is interesting to you and useful to you, please have a look at those as well. As you know, we depend on your contributions to help offset the costs of this lecture series, and we are always grateful for your donations. If you enjoy the lectures, please consider supporting us in any way that you are able. If you make a contribution of $10 or more, we can give you a tax receipt for that. Also, as I'm currently planning for our program for next year, I would invite you to make any suggestions for speakers that you might have. I'd love to hear them. I can't make any promises, but I'll do my best if you have some good ideas. One other thing I'd like to do now is I hope that you have seen some of the... I hope you have parked in the right spot. I hope you've seen this slide that has talked about our Beyond Borders students. And I'm going to stop it right here. I apologize for our technical difficulties. We always have some exciting thing happening here. Tonight it's this. I hope you've heard about our wonderful program here called Beyond Borders. It's a service learning program where students take courses but also go out into the local community. They volunteer at the Working Center. That's one thing that they do. And finally, when they're finished all the coursework and the time that they spend here at the university, they go out and they live for 3 months somewhere in the developing world. And this year we've got students going to the Ukraine, Botswana, Ghana, Honduras, Ecuador, Bosnia-Herzegovina, and Nicaragua. You can follow the learning experience of these students by reading their blogs. A blog is a weblog, sort of like a journal, and you can find those on the St. Jerome's University Beyond Borders website under Get to Know Our Students or Meet Our Students. They're wonderful blogs, so I really encourage you if you get a chance to have a look. These are a really wonderful, wonderful group of people, and it's neat to see the progress that they're making through this program. But several of those students are here with us this evening, and I would like to invite them all up here, if they will come, to tell us a little bit about an upcoming fundraiser event that they are planning for this weekend.
Hello, everyone. So before we get started with our announcement, we'll just do a quick shout-out with our names, our country placement, and if you have any questions, we'll be in the lobby afterwards and you can ask. So I'm Jessica, and I'll be in Ukraine this summer.
I'm Matt, and I'll be heading to Botswana.
I'm Ruby, I'm also going to Botswana. I'm Vanier, and I'm also going to Botswana. I'm Katie, and I'm going to Ghana. I'm Krista, and I'm going to Nicaragua. I'm Krista, I'm going to Ecuador. I'm Jen, and I'll be going to Ukraine.
Oh boy, every time I speak in front of people, something happens. Anyways, we would love to invite all of you to our fundraiser this Sunday on March 8th. We will be hosting our first pancake breakfast fundraiser. The Beyond Borders program at St. Jerome's University provides educational and service experience for undergraduate students interested in putting their education to use in the pursuit of a more just and peaceable world. This year, there are 13 students who will be traveling to several developing countries and volunteering in a variety of placements. Placements include teaching, working in youth centers, orphanages, and health clinics, and more. The fundraiser will be held in Sweeney Hall White Room, the girls' cafeteria, from 10:30 a.m. to 1:30 p.m. following the Sunday morning masses. We are suggesting a minimum $5 donation for pancakes, sausage, and juice and coffee. We welcome your support and encouragement as we prepare for our various placements. Thank you very much.
I had the pleasure of working with these students this year, and they really are a really great group of young people. And if you can support them even with your words, that's a wonderful thing, so please do so. This evening we have with us Ms. Marion Thompson-Howell, who is the chair of the board of the Waterloo Catholic District School Board, and she will come up and just give us a few remarks on the behalf of the board before we begin our lecture tonight.
Welcome. One thing about the community that we live in is that we are very good at partnering with those groups who have shared values, shared interests. And the partnership that the Waterloo Catholic District School Board has had with St. Jerome's University is a long one, and one that we value. And this lecture is a series that we've been very proud to sponsor over many years. We are pleased that you have joined us this evening, and certainly look forward to you enjoying it as much as we will. Thank you very much.
All right, one more brief one, and this is simply to invite our own Dr. Christina Vannon to introduce tonight's speaker. Thank you.
And I actually don't know anything about Paul and women, for those of you that had to listen to me all day yesterday. But I do know something about Carolyn Whitney-Brown. So I'm very happy that Joanne asked me if I would introduce Carolyn to you formally. She is a good friend and colleague, and has been a friend and colleague for a number of years now. And since she's been here this time, I said to her, "Can you remember exactly when we first met and how we possibly met and how this all came about that we are the friends and colleagues that we are?" And neither of us can remember where it all started. So that either says something about our memories, and it probably says something about that. But more truthfully, it speaks to the fact, as Carolyn said to me, that it seems as if we have always been friends. Carolyn completed her BA at the University of Toronto. She took a double major there, one in English at Victoria College and in the Christianity and Culture program at the University of St. Michael's College. Then she went on to do her MA and Ph.D. at Brown University in Rhode Island. And her doctoral thesis there focused on the social and the political meaning of childbirth stories in modern England, stories by Shakespeare and others. In terms of her publications, some of her more recent work includes a contribution to a wonderful anthology called Northern Lights, an anthology of contemporary Christian writing in Canada. And her essay is entitled No Hurry in L'Arche. She also has a couple of studies of Henri Nouwen. One of them is called How Not to Comfort a New Orleans Hurricane Survivor. And that appears in the 2007 book put out by Novalis called Turning the Wheel, Henri Nouwen and Our Search for God. There are people creeping around me. Yes? Okay. The other work is called L'Arche Daybreak, Celebration and Hard Work, and that's published by Orbis in 2006 in the text called Remembering Heart, the Life and Legacy of Henri Nouwen. Respected in both mainline and evangelical circles, Carolyn has coordinated national products for the Canadian Council of Churches, the Evangelical Fellowship of Canada, and the United Church of Canada. And for a decade she taught in the continuing education program at the University of St. Michael's in Toronto. Since moving to Vancouver Island, and she did that after an incredible year with her family of exploring North America, Carolyn is busy cheering on her kids in their various sports endeavors, and thankfully one of her daughters enjoys volleyball as much as I do. She is basking in the beauty of the West Coast. She is writing. And speaking personally, fortunately for me and for our students, she is teaching, has taught for us in our Master of Catholic Thought program, and she also teaches distance education courses for our Religious Studies program. Tonight we are pleased to have Carolyn here to speak with us about her most recent book, Jean Vanier Essential Writings, published in 2008 by Orbis. And it is something that she can speak about with great passion and from a wealth of experience, because Carolyn and her family were part of the L'Arche Daybreak community in Richmond Hill from 1990 to 1997. This collection of writings was published to mark Jean Vanier's 80th birthday. And it reflects one of the great discoveries of Vanier's life, when he says, "We are healed by the poor and the weak. We are transformed by them if we enter into relationship with them, because the weak and the vulnerable have a gift to give to our world. They call us together in unity and peace to build community." We are thrilled that Carolyn can be here tonight to talk to us and with us about Jean Vanier's life and work. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Carolyn Whitney-Brown.
Now that Christina quoted that, I can take a paragraph out of my paper. Excellent. Well, it's good to be here at St. Jerome's in Waterloo with you tonight. I went to the Andy Warhol exhibit at the Children's Museum today. And if I understood it correctly, in the summer of 1964, Andy Warhol was silkscreening prints of Jackie Kennedy and painting plywood replicas of Campbell soup boxes, filming the Empire State Building, and creating an innovative wild space in his studio, which was called The Factory, where he welcomed anyone who walked in the door as social equals. It was his big experiment. So con artists, writers, anyone who came in, musicians, prostitutes, workers, beggars, riffraff, bartenders, hustlers, tramps, anyone who came in the door was equal and welcome, and it was his experiment in democracy. Meanwhile, in the summer of 1964, in the southern states in the U.S., you had the Freedom Summer, where thousands of civil rights volunteers were braving threats and beatings and arrests and, if you remember, murder, to register voter rights in Mississippi. It was a different way to stand for equality. And at the same time, across an ocean in France, Jean Vanier and two friends with intellectual disabilities were quietly founding an extraordinary household. Yet another experiment in welcome and social inclusion. I was walking around the Warhol exhibit thinking that that Jean's part of his time and the spirit of his age in some really interesting ways. So in the 45 years since, Jean and Raphael and Philippe's little experiment has influenced hundreds of thousands of people worldwide. I started reading Jean Vanier's books in the late 1970s, and I first met Jean in person in 1990. He was visiting the L'Arche Daybreak community where I was living, and he was getting ready to speak to the community after lunch. He folded his rather tall frame into one of those folding chairs and was ready to speak, and then one of the community members, long-term members, David Harmon, dragged an exercise mat up and spread it right out at his feet. And he said, "You always put me to sleep, Jean." And Jean's eyes just lit up. He loved it, and he said, "It's that dangerously sleepy time after lunch. It's all right if you go to sleep. I'll keep speaking as long as there's one person still awake." And then he leaned forward and he said, "But when you wake up, listen. That's the prophetic word for you, the moment for which you've been awakened." So if you had a good dinner and find yourself nodding off, don't worry, I'll keep talking, but when you wake up, listen, it might be your prophetic moment. Well, Jean Vanier turned 80 last September. With characteristic humor, he'd written years earlier that, quote, birthday celebrations provide a chance to emphasize certain stages in people's lives, highlight their gifts, laugh about their faults or failures, and celebrate each one's unique gifts. When Jean turned 80, the Canadian Globe and Mail newspaper rose to the occasion, commending his peacemaking, ecumenism, and humanitarianism. The editorial you might have read endorsed Vanier as a worthy candidate for the Nobel Peace Prize, created to honor those who have, quote, greatly contributed to fraternity among human beings across the world. It is the Nobel Prize. And I hope you've all been reading the incredible series of letters between Vanier and Ian Brown that have been running in the Globe and Mail. Now, Jean is doubtful of the value of a linear look at his life, saying, if I were to write an autobiography to move through my life chronologically, describing the things that have happened to me and the people I've met, it would not be possible to explain the purpose and meaning of my life. But I beg to differ, actually. The shape of Jean's life and the influence on his life, I think, are crucial in understanding his inspiration. So since he's not here to object, I'm going to walk with you through Jean's life. Jean's life spans a critical period in global change, from his coming of age during World War II to the environmental globalized issues of the early 21st century. He was born in Switzerland on September 10th, 1928, to Canadian parents. At the time, Georges Vanier was military advisor to the Canadian delegation to the League of Nations in Geneva. Jean Vanier's maternal grandmother's ancestors had come to North America in the 1730s. His grandmother, Thérèse de Salaberry-Archer, was a deeply spiritual woman whose gentle spiritual director had also guided Sainte Thérèse of Lisieux. His maternal grandfather had been named to the Superior Court of Quebec at the young age of 42. I hope you don't mind me giving the pedigree. I thought it was really interesting. They had one child, Pauline. When World War I erupted, she applied to be a foot soldier. Turned down, she trained as a nurse, working long hours in a military convalescent hospital until the end of the war. By 1919, she'd applied to a convent, but then she met Georges Phileas Vanier in Montreal over tea at the Ritz-Carlton. Georges Vanier was a young Montreal lawyer when World War I began in 1914. Accounts from Europe awakened his compassion, and he helped organize Canada's first French-Canadian volunteer unit, the Royal 22nd Regiment, now famous as the Vandus. Wounded in battle, his right leg amputated, he returned to Canada, a respected and decorated officer, and met Pauline. They married in 1921, and Jean is the fourth of the 5 Vanier children. As Europe ended in the 1930s with political insecurity and rumors of impending war, Georges Vanier was appointed Canadian minister to France and took his family with him. They were soon on the move again. Jean wrote, "In May-June 1940, I was 11 years old and a refugee, with my family fleeing the north of France invaded by the Nazi army. They took a boat to England, and even arriving in England was not easy. A traumatic 5-day passage brought them to Falmouth, but they couldn't enter the port because of mines. They landed in Wales, getting to London in time for some of the fiercest bombing of the war. In 1941, they made the dangerous Atlantic crossing in convoy to Canada. Jean recalls, at dinner one night as we crossed the North Atlantic, we heard the Nazi English radio announce that our ship had been sunk. I don't think I felt any fear during those days. It all seemed part of a great adventure for an 11-year-old boy." Well, less than 2 years later, Jean Vanier paid his father a memorable visit in his office. Now 13, tall and articulate, he presented his father his plan, as he wryly describes it today, to cross the U-boat-filled ocean again, to join the Royal Navy College in blitzed southern England. Even more astonishing than Jean's 13-year-old request was his father's response. He said, "Explain to me what it is you really want and why you want to join the Navy." And Jean says, "I forget what I said, but when I'd finished, I remember his answer. He said, 'I trust you. And if that is what you want, then that's what you must do.' I didn't realize at the time, but that was probably one of the most healing moments of my life, because my father, whom I loved and admired, trusted me, then I could trust myself." For any other mothers out there, his mom didn't quite feel so keen about it, but his dad talked her into it. It was an early sign of the many intuitive choices that would shape Jean's adult life. Jean was among the better students of his class at Dartmouth and played tennis and rugby when the college was bombed just before his second term. The students were all safely moved to an alternative location. A curious story he tells of his college days, one of the few ones he likes to tell, is the curious practice of ordering Catholics to fall out during formal parade. The Catholics would step forward, turn smartly, go behind a hedge, and say the Hail Mary. While the other students said the prayer all Christians share, they said the Our Father. It was Jean's first experience of awkward ecumenical accommodation. When Paris was liberated in August 1944, Georges Vanier was the first accredited diplomat to arrive in the city. Pauline Vanier went with him, and Jean visited soon afterwards. He recalls, I accompanied my mother, who was in the Canadian Red Cross, to the train station where hundreds of men and women arrived like skeletons in their striped blue and white uniforms from Dachau, Buchenwald, Ravensbrück, and other concentration camps, their faces tortured with fear, anguish, and pain. The horror of the Hiroshima bomb and the instantaneous deaths of tens of thousands of people also affected him deeply. We became conscious, he says, of the capacity of humanity to destroy itself. This is important because as a young person, Jean was directly confronted with many aspects of both the technology and the human cost of war. In 1947, Jean was appointed to the HMS Vanguard, which took King George VI and the royal family to visit South Africa. On board, there were teas and deck games with the royal princesses, Elizabeth and Margaret, who were about the same age as the young officers. Well, Jean transferred to the Canadian Navy after that and was based in Halifax as an officer on the Magnificent, which was Canada's only aircraft carrier. Jean was 21 in the spring of 1950 when the Magnificent went to Cuba on joint training exercises with the U.S. Navy. He was reading the American monk Thomas Merton's autobiography, The Seven-Story Mountain, and seized a stop in New York to go to Harlem to visit Friendship House. Delighted with that community of people who were marginalized and poor, he ended up spending all his free time in New York with his new friends. And before his ship left port, he happily invited 15 of his new friends to dinner in the officers' dining room on board the Magnificent. As Jean matured through his experiences, reading and reflection, he became conscious of a desire to change his life direction. And he says, when I left the Navy after 8 years, I was a fully trained, efficient, and disciplined officer. I could lead men, I could wield weapons, and I could help direct ships of war. I was accomplished in climbing the ladder of promotion, greater prosperity, success, and achievement. There was never a moment when I didn't know what I should be doing. I had directions and duties and responsibilities. I was happy serving in the Navy and traveling to various parts of the world, but I also felt torn inside and somehow dissatisfied. My heart and my spirit were searching for something more. By 1950, after a 30-day retreat following the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius, Jean made his decision to resign from the Navy. My place in the world was somewhere else, Jean felt, but there was no clear model for the kind of search Jean felt called to. Unlike the Navy, that as soon as it had accepted him took full responsibility for his education and formation, Jean would now need to follow his intuition. Pauline Vanier introduced her son to her spiritual director, a Dominican priest named Thomas Philippe. The powerful bond that was immediately formed with Père Thomas would shape the rest of Jean's life. Père Thomas' story is interesting in itself. He was born in 1905, one of 12 children, and by the time he was 5, he was absolutely certain he wanted to be a priest. In 1947, Père Thomas was now a Dominican and a professor, and he began a community called Eau Vive, a small community close to the Dominican Theological College for students to study philosophy and theology. And the students lived in community and lived a communal life of love, reconciliation, and charity. It was the first place of study in France to welcome a German student after the war. A friend who came to visit Jean there in 1951 described Arabic philosophers, a Persian merchants, several Germans, a woman who went into a concentration camp for being a key worker in the underground during the war. There were 80 students from 20 countries with a strong Middle Eastern contingent. Visiting professors such as Jacques Maritain, Charles Journet, and Oliver Lacombe, who was a scholar of Hindu mystical experience, taught summer courses. Jean had a powerful experience of spiritual connection with Père Thomas. In a 2005 interview, he notes that Père Thomas didn't want to give answers. He wanted to give tools for people to be able to recognize and understand the choices in their lives. He would listen and then say, pray about it. He didn't tell Jean what to do, but as Jean says, helped me to discover the Holy Spirit within me. His was a pedagogy of helping people to trust themselves, to trust God. In April 1952, Père Thomas was removed by Rome for unorthodoxy and for spiritual direction that was considered too mystical. It was the period in which Rome also removed worker priests, as well as ordained professors who seemed too caught up in psychology, communism, or other contemporary intellectual movements. Jean was asked by the board to assume the leadership of the community and stayed until 1956. Now, Jean could have been ordained a priest, and he made inquiries about the process. At one point, he seemed he would be ordained in Quebec and sent back to France as a chaplain. His mother happily purchased a stolen chalice in anticipation. But as he discerned his call, including a 1959 visit with his parents to their old friend, who was now Pope John XXIII, Jean became aware that his path really was elsewhere. He needed the freedom to respond to God's Spirit by following his own intuition. Trusting himself as his father had trusted him in his teens, and trusting the Holy Spirit within him as Père Thomas had encouraged him, he became convinced that he needed to listen for his call from God from outside the ecclesial structure. In 1962, he completed his doctorate, studying. Somehow when I first heard this, I thought, of course, Jean Vanier would do Aristotle's understanding of happiness. Jean identifies his fascination with Aristotle, whose fundamental orientation both resembled and shaped Jean's own. He says Aristotle is one of the great witnesses to this quest for happiness. His fundamental question is not what ought we to do, but what do we really want? His ethics are not those of law. Jean's thesis went deeper than an intellectual exercise. It provided foundations for the intuitive choices that continued to shape his journey. He says, my research into the basis of Aristotelian ethics helped me to grasp the connection between ethics, psychology, and spirituality. Psychology helps us to understand human behavior and grasp the fears and blockages that are in us in order to help us free ourselves of them. Spirituality is like a breath of inspiration that strengthens our motivation. Ethics help us to clarify what is a truly human act, what justice is, and what the best activities are, those that render us more human and happiest. They help us better understand to what our freedom is calling us. Just before Christmas 1963, Jean and others of Père Thomas' friends helped Père Thomas move into 2 modest rooms in Trolly, France, where Père Thomas had accepted a position as chaplain to the Val Fleury, a small institution for men with intellectual handicaps. Jean's visit included a theatrical production at the Val. The experience touched him, but he was self-conscious and quite uneasy among the men there. It was his first encounter with people with intellectual disabilities. Still, Père Thomas offered Jean the idea that he might do something, quote-unquote, with people with intellectual disabilities. Jean was offered a temporary teaching position at St. Michael's College that winter in Toronto, and rapidly became a popular teacher. Here's his description. This was the first time I'd ever taught. I was supposed to teach ethics, but found my students weren't terribly interested in justice. So instead I started talking about the meaning of friendship and about sexuality. Guess what? Students overflowed his class. Jean was offered a permanent position at St. Michael's College, but he wanted to be close to Père Thomas and all that his mentor was learning. As soon as term was over, he went back to France. Père Thomas and I had the deep conviction that we had been called together by Jesus to accomplish something, Jean wrote later. In France, Jean visited institutions. He was struck by people's screams and the heavy atmosphere, and yet also by a mysterious presence of God. I was touched by these men with mental handicaps, by their sadness and by their cry to be respected, valued, and loved, he wrote. A similar hunger was actually growing in Jean himself, who had never considered the human weakness or longings in himself. He wrote, since I was a child, there have been 3 distinct stages in my life. When I was 13, I joined the Navy and spent 8 years in a world where weakness was something to be shunned at all costs. We were required to be efficient and quick and to climb the ladder of success. I loved this world, and another world opened up to me, the world of thought. For many years, I studied philosophy. Once again, I found myself in a world where weakness, ignorance, and incompetence were things to be shunned. Efficiency was everything. Then during a 3rd phase, I discovered people who were weak, people with mental handicaps. I was moved by the vast world of poverty, weakness, and fragility that I encountered in hospitals, institutions, and asylums for people with mental handicaps. I moved from the world of theories and ideas about human beings in order to discover what it really meant to be human. The something Père Thomas had suggested was taking shape in Jean's mind, a small foyer or family-sized house to share with some of the men he met. in his visit to institutions. Jean consulted his parents. Georges Vanier was by now Canadian Governor-General, a position he held from 1959 until his death in 1967. Pauline Vanier was not taken with her son's latest idea. Their trusted friend Tony Walsh encouraged them to support Jean's vision, seeing in it a gospel inspiration in the same spirit as his own Benedict Labre house in Montreal, which offered accommodation and friendship to homeless men. Deciding yet again to trust the intuitions of their unconventional son, Jean's parents helped Jean buy a small house in Troley, within walking distance of Père Thomas. With the help of the director of an asylum for the intellectually handicapped that Jean had visited, he chose 3 men. His invitation was for a 1-month holiday, and at the end of the month, the possibility of a permanent home would be confirmed. On August 4th, 1964, Jean moved into L'Arche, a house so simple that there was no toilet, only a bucket, and no electricity. On August 5th, he was joined by Raphael Simi, Philippe Sieux, and a 3rd man named Danny. A celebratory welcome luncheon officially launched the new community, then the guests departed, and the 4 men were left together. The first night, Danny was so needy and disturbed that Jean recognized the situation was intolerable. The next day, Jean regretfully returned him to his institutional life. The other 2 men and Jean continued on together. Jean knew that with these 2 men, Raphael and Philippe, he'd made an irrevocable choice for his life. Now, in keeping with Jean's insistence that birthdays are a time to help people recognize and reread their personal histories, for Jean's 80th birthday, I wrote for him an alternative history of L'Arche. He liked it so much that he had it read at an international L'Arche meeting in India last fall, so I'm sure he would not mind my sharing it with you. Here's its beginning, a different way to frame the beginnings of L'Arche. So this is the first piece. In 1964, 3 men who lived in Troley offered a lonely foreigner with a dilapidated old house in the village the chance to build a sense of home with them. Bravely, they had a good luncheon with some mutual friends, then settled into getting to know Jean Vanier. After the first night, one man realized that he could not help the vulnerable Canadian further. The idealistic, unstructured, primitive life that his Canadian acquaintance offered did not satisfy his own adult needs. And although the foreigner spoke excellent French, he could not communicate with someone deaf. But the other 2, Raphael and Philippe, saw something in the eager, hopeful Canadian. Both men were able to hear and thus could communicate with Jean, who was very verbal. They were willing to help this man, who had not had a secure home with others for many years, to find home with them. It was a bold risk. They were making a commitment that was irrevocable. Well, in a way, as you look at Jean's life, it's a story with a curiously mythic and familiar shape. The son of a distinguished family with high ideals of service joins the military in wartime. Reading the Gospels awakens a different kind of idealism for spiritual service. Think St. Francis, think St. Ignatius. Living simply, often in solitude, he broadens his horizons through studies and also gets to know people who are very poor, moved by these real relationships. Recognizing his own poverty, he forms a community to live simply with the poor. Drawn by his vision and charisma, others come to join him, and soon communities exist on 3 continents and continue to grow. And it's sort of intriguing. Jean's life does follow a pattern of many faithful Christians, such as St. Francis, St. Ignatius, St. Martin. But each life is unique and part of its particular historical moment. And Jean was not alone. Raphael and Philippe's choice to join and stay with Jean shows enormous courage and trust. In 1987, Pope John Paul movingly acknowledged that when he presented Jean with the International Paul VI Award. He said, "The distinction conferred today particularly honors individuals with handicaps, from the first 2 whom Jean Vanier took into his home to the great number of those who currently belong to L'Arche. Indeed, they are the principal figures of L'Arche, who with faith, patience, and a fraternal spirit make it a sign of hope and a joyful witness to the redemption." Meanwhile, back in Jean's little house in 1964, it turned out the house did have electricity. Jean found the power box a few days later. And the little house hummed along for several months, its circle of friends and support expanding rapidly, and then came a big change At the end of 1964, all the staff at the Val Fleury resigned, effective in March. Jean was asked to become director of this institution where 32 men with various intellectual disabilities lived and worked. Jean, happy in his new L'Arche home, was reluctant. But in March 1965, Jean moved to the Val Fleury. 2 staff members remained to help. The previous director offered minimal information, handed him a large, heavy bundle of keys to files, doors, offices, and cupboards, and left. Within an hour, the keys were stolen and were never found. I felt very alone, Jean recalls. The Val, with its constant noise, shouting, and frequent violence, was very different than his small L'Arche house. L'Arche was no longer a small prophetic community where we were living poorly with the poor, Jean wrote. There was a budget to draw up and an accounts sheet to balance. The poverty of the situation attracted friends. Volunteers came from the village to help with gardening, bookkeeping, and cooking. By November 1965, Jean was writing a circular letter with news of our 2 communities, the Val Fleury and the original L'Arche house. May I ask if any of you have any old bird cages or bicycles? He inquires. Those of us who are most disabled could care for and watch the birds. Others, accompanied by an assistant, could take bike rides in the forest. L'Arche began to grow. The second L'Arche community, L'Arche Daybreak, was begun by Anglican friends of Jean's, Stephen and Newroth, on land in Richmond Hill donated by Our Lady's missionaries. The Daybreak community celebrates its 40th anniversary this year. Thus, the second L'Arche community began as an interdenominational community of Anglicans, United Church members, and Roman Catholics. A year later, the third community was founded in India, and it was interfaith. Jean's first trip to India changed him, opening him to a wider world and to his own yearnings for justice and peace. His excitement radiates off the pages of his letters. A letter from a visit the next year reads, I feel more and more taken with India and by Gandhi, one of the only men who has tried to find a spiritual solution of peace, love, prayer, and simple work for an entire country. I've been rereading what he wrote on prayer, on the love of God and on humility. I would especially like to live it. I sense all that is happening within me and I feel impatient. Mother Teresa of the Sisters of Charity encouraged and befriended Jean. He remembers Mother Teresa had a great gift for the dying. She understood the mystery of the body, how touching and tending a broken person could lead to a real encounter, he recalls. Well, Jean's experience was bringing him more and more in touch with the suffering and courage of families of people with intellectual and physical handicaps. In the late 1960s, a French woman named Marie-Hélène Mathieu and Jean began planning a pilgrimage to Lourdes for people with intellectual disabilities, their parents, and friends. The impetus was a quite disturbing experience of a family with 2 boys with mental and physical disabilities. They went to Lourdes but were shunned by hotels. And the hotel that finally allowed them to stay required them to eat in their rooms to avoid disturbing other guests. Lourdes is, of course, a place of consolation, of healing for people who are in need and broken. The family was deeply hurt by the rejection they experienced in such a holy place. So Marie-Hélène and Jean did the obvious thing. They proposed an international pilgrimage to Lourdes for people with intellectual disabilities, their parents and their friends. And Easter 1971 brought 12,000 pilgrims from 15 countries to Lourdes. Isn't that the obvious thing to do? Jean recalls, we lived 4 days of intense personal encounters and community celebrations. We sang, we prayed, we met and talked together. Everything was organized so that the weakest and most vulnerable were not only included, but at the center of all the events. For once, they were the guests of honor, the privileged ones, the ones welcomed in a special way. On the final day, we had a huge fiesta on the Esplanade. It was a time of joy for all the pilgrims, but perhaps most especially for the parents who no longer felt alone, Jean said. Planning and traveling had been done in local groups. We suggested these groups stay in contact, and suddenly Faith and Light turned from a one-time pilgrimage into an international organization. And today in 2009, there are 1,500 Faith and Light communities in 80 countries. As interest in Faith and Light and L'Arche spread, Jean traveled internationally to new communities, meetings and retreats and formation events. His letters describe daily life and friends in the cultural and political history and current events of India, Haiti, Brazil, Honduras, Guatemala, Ivory Coast, Poland, Italy, Australia, New Zealand, Northern Ireland and Ireland, Papua New Guinea, Lebanon, Israel. He traveled at least once a year to Canada, speaking at universities, at retreats, and in prisons in both Canada and the U.S. By 1977, 17 more L'Arche communities had begun in the United States and Canada, 3 in Belgium, 5 in France, 2 in UK, 2 in Scandinavia, and 7 in Haiti, Honduras, and Africa and India. Well, the reader of Jean's letters to L'Arche communities and friends through the 70s cannot help but notice Jean's growing exhaustion. The crowds in India became overwhelming rather than energizing. The suffering he sees weighs him down. It comes as no surprise when his letter dated April 18th, 1976 begins, "Dear friends, I am still in Cochin Hospital, France, with a bit of a fever." Well, I want to step back from Jean's life for a moment here and think about the overall shape we see. An Australian anthropologist named Jerry Arbuckle has written extensively about the founding and refounding of religious communities. And in a letter to me, he wrote this: "In my analysis of refounding, I used examples from the great founders and refounders of religious congregations. In each case, I stressed that each person had to experience some extremely deep personal crisis of identity, a Gethsemane experience, such as Christ underwent. It is an intensely lonely experience that is likened to darkness, desert, night. Most often, the catalyst for this experience comes from a friend or colleague who simply cannot grasp the depth of the insight the founder happens to experience. This Gethsemane experience is integral to the authenticity of the founding story. Anything is fantasy without its retelling." Now, times of crisis and breakage are actually not explicit in Jean's writing. Michael Higgins names that very precisely in an astute and thoughtful review of Jean's book of letters, writing, "How does Vanier know he's right? And this is what is missing in these largely bloodless letters: the struggle, the self-doubt, the crippled love, the imperfect hope." And these seem to be crucial questions, and while I won't pretend to offer answers, I do want to offer a few observations. First, maybe it's obvious, but Jean's background is not conducive to a deep sharing of interior anguish or personal vulnerability. Think about it. He's the son of cautious and skilled diplomats. He was raised in wartime. Remember those posters that the walls have ears? He went on to a military education with its emphasis on containment and self-control. And his mentor was severely punished by Rome for being too self-revealing of his own mystical experiences. And Jean is much taken with John the Baptist, who deflects from himself to point the way to one greater. Jean has really wanted the story of L'Arche to be about God, not about himself. But I see 3 points of pain, breakage, and doubt and growth in Jean's life that he does write about. This illness in 1976, a year in the L'Arche house La Forestière in 1980, and ongoing disagreements with Père Thomas. Let's explore these, returning first to 1976. Jean's letters from the hospital were cheerful, but do refer in passing to pain, high fever, terrible backaches. His roommate rubbed his back on sleepless nights when he was in the worst pain. Doctors could not find an effective treatment, and despite various courses of antibiotics, Jean's fever and pain continued for weeks. There was some genuine humor. After a few uncomfortable days, staff promised to bring their tall patient de Gaulle's bed. To Jean's amused delight, it actually was an extra-long hospital bed, acquired when his parents' old friend, French President Charles de Gaulle, was a patient. But it was not easy for Jean to find himself weak and insecure. He writes, "Jesus is giving me an understanding of what it means to be an assisted person. After 12 years in L'Arche as an assistant, I am now experiencing what it's like to be on the other side. It is teaching me a lot, not to be the one who has power, but to be weak." In all, Jean spent 2 months in the hospital and 3 further months recovering. A letter written from Honduras shortly after Jean resumed traveling suggests ways in which Jean was changed by his experience of illness. He highlights in a new way the importance of spending spontaneous, unscheduled time with people. His own experience of being assisted in his weakness underlies some questions about the problematic aspects of L'Arche's distinction between the assisted and the assistants. He wrote, "Everything I see here in Honduras makes me really question our L'Arche communities and the double culture of the assistants and the assisted that can exist. The danger that can arise when the assistants possess power and security and benefit from the assisted in order to gain a certain prestige." In the autumn of 1980, Jean stepped down from his role as community director and moved to live for a sabbatical year in La Forestière, a large home in Trolly for 10 men and women with profound physical disabilities. This time of living with people who needed constant attention was one of tenderness, but it was also one of the hardest years of his life. He grew to love his friends at La Forestière, and they pushed him to grow. Jean vividly described an important aspect of that experience. He speaks about his friend Lucien. Lucien was born with severe mental and physical disabilities. He cannot talk or walk or move his arms. His body is a bit twisted, and he has to remain in his wheelchair or in his bed. He never looks anyone directly in the eyes. He lived the first 30 years of his life with his mother, who cared for him and understood Lucien and his needs. One day she fell sick and had to go to the hospital. Lucien was put into another hospital and plunged into a totally strange and unknown world. Screams of anguish rose up in him. Finally, he came to La Forestière. We felt quite powerless in front of his constant screaming. If we tried to touch him, to calm him down, this very touch seemed to increase his anguish. There was nothing to do but wait. The pitch of Lucien's scream was piercing and seemed to penetrate the very core of my being, awakening my own inner anguish. I could sense anger, violence, and even hatred rising up in me. I would have been capable of hurting him to keep him quiet. It was as if a part of my being that I had learned to control was exploding. It was not only Lucien's anguish that was difficult for me to accept, but the revelation of what was inside my own heart, my capacity to hurt others. I, who had been called to share my life with the weak, had a power of hatred for a weak person. Well, Jean's time in hospital and living in La Forestière opened for him a more realistic articulation of how L'Arche is founded on the body. He became more able after that to speak of his own suffering and the importance of each person recognizing their own, quote, hidden places of pain. Little by little, we can become a friend of our weakness. As he said to an audience at Harvard, and just keep this audience in mind, a Harvard audience, I discovered something which I had never confronted before, that there were immense forces of darkness and hatred within my own heart. At particular moments of fatigue or stress, I saw forces of hate rising up in me and the capacity to hurt someone who was weak and was provoking me. That, I think, was what caused me the most pain, to discover who I really am and to realize that maybe I did not want to know who I really was. I did not want to admit all the garbage inside me, and then I had to decide whether I would just continue to pretend that I was okay and throw myself into hyperactivity, projects where I could forget all the garbage and prove to others how good I was. Elitism is the sickness of us all. We all want to be on the winning team. And Jean went on to tell his Harvard audience that healing is found at the bottom of the ladder, not the top. A further articulation comes in a letter specifically to Faith and Light communities. He wrote, "I'm not ignoring the importance of celebrations in L'Arche and Faith and Light, or all the joys of communion between us, and I do not want to be pessimistic. But the experience of these 34 years in L'Arche have shown me that in order to be faithful on a long-term basis and to be committed to working for unity, we have to learn how to remain close to suffering, how to hold on in situations of pain. We have to discover compassion." Well, the third area of suffering for Jean is that he and his mentor, Père Thomas, did not always agree about the meaning or lifestyle of L'Arche. Most simply, in a way, Père Thomas always had his eye on the next life, on preparing to die and be united with God. In a way, he was more a follower of Plato, seeing this world as a shadow of a better one. Jean was more Aristotelian, committed to understanding this world in order to live the best possible human life. The conflict between them at times was very hard for both. In his final years before his death in 1993, Père Thomas moved to live in the community of his brother, who was also a priest. Reflecting in 2007, Jean wrote, "In many ways his life epitomized that of L'Arche itself, and for some time after his death I couldn't speak of him without weeping, because the union between us had been so deep. His death, however, was not an end. Life and L'Arche continue to flow with all he has given and gives." Along with these times of self-doubt and self-examination, Jean continued to travel extensively and to give retreats. In March 1980, Jean was in Honduras when Archbishop Oscar Romero was murdered in nearby El Salvador. "The death of Archbishop Romero de San Salvador has shaken the country," he wrote to his community. "People are afraid. He was a man of peace who identified himself with the poor and who preached nonviolence and reconciliation. I was in Choluteca to give a retreat on the day he was killed. There was an official mass for him at the cathedral, and I was asked to give the homily. It was a grace for me to speak of Romero, who, like Jesus, was not afraid to speak the truth again and again." After September 11th, 2001, Jean wrote a short, heartfelt book titled Finding Peace. Noting the events of September 11th called me to become personally committed to peacemaking, to continue to reflect on peace and on the sources of violence in our world, in me, and in each one of us. He was simultaneously moved and thoughtful about the way in which people gathered to express desire and fear. He wrote, "People from various cultures and religions, as well as people with no specific religious tradition, came together after the attacks to pray and to affirm together their vision of mutual acceptance and their esteem and love for all human beings. And yet the evenings of prayer I participated in left me a bit uneasy. I felt as though people were not praying for a new just order between people and nations, but motivated by fear were praying to keep the status quo, no change, no insecurity, nothing that would disturb their lives or views on the world." For decades, Jean has been exploring how human beings open themselves to change. Is insecurity a necessary path to finding the happiness that people and communities deeply desire? As I put together the anthology of Jean's work, I became aware of an interesting movement in Jean's life. That Jean's transformation was not from inner psychological or spiritual maturity to community responsibility to global awareness and commitment. Rather, for Jean, that direction seemed to me to be reversed. That born into a Canadian diplomatic family with a strong global sense of public service, Jean was intensely aware of political and global realities. And then leaving his military career in his 20s, he lived in a community of theological students from around the world, and then made this lifelong decision to live in community with people with intellectual disabilities. And then through their friendship, Jean's own heart was transformed, and his understanding of himself deepened and became more honest. Thus, for Jean, the movement was actually from global consciousness to community to personal change. And it struck me that many current spiritual and self-help books assume that we must do deep inward work first, to change ourselves and reach a certain level of self-awareness, and then move outward into engagement in our wider society. But the problem is that many people don't move beyond their inner work stage, being both self-aware and self-absorbed enough to know that they have a long way to go still. Their moment of leadership and responsibility thus gets endlessly delayed in the world. And Jean's experience tells us that to take responsibility and to do our best in community will change our hearts and our world. Jean famously says, "Change the world with love, one heart at a time." So for Jean, our human work is not simply internal growth or accepting our humanness. We each have something to offer. Jean returns to his foundational reading of philosophy, noting the vision of the ancients was to have a mission for eternity. Everything dies, but all have the mission to transmit life. This is the meaning of life. When Jean read a draft of my introduction, he wrote to me, and he said, "Maybe the secret of my life is the living day by day with people with intellectual disabilities. They are my strength, my source. This life together is the source of my word, retreats, conferences, etc., but there is also the silence of being in communion with Jesus." So in my remaining few minutes here, I want to briefly explore these two key aspects of Jean's life, looking at what Jean says about community and about prayer. Now, because he writes about all aspects of community life, Jean's public work covers an extraordinary variety of topics. He'll address directly topics at which many spiritual writers would flinch. If you look in Jean's book, you can find out about washing dishes, leisure activities, leading meetings, drinking wine, the complexity of human sexuality, masturbation, our society's approach to inclusion and exclusion, world peace, spiritual practices, love of enemies, living in reality, the secret mystery of each human heart, gospel stories, prayers, activism, the roots of depression, and rituals around death. And as I read his books, I began to think that few nonfiction writers can discuss comfortably such a concrete spectrum of human experience. Jean's sense of humor about community life shines through, especially in books based on his talks. He delightedly described to a Harvard audience the dangers of mutual flattery. We are all so much in need of affection that when someone gives it to us, we want to hold on to it. Then we say to the other person, "You're wonderful. Keep at it. Keep flattering me. You know it's nice." We're like little cats who need to be caressed. We then begin to purr. To a large conference in Northern Ireland called Encountering the Other, Jean noted, "At the heart of the message of Jesus is love your enemies, do good to those who hate you, speak well of those who speak evilly of you, pray for those who crush you and persecute you." It sounds beautiful. Have you ever tried to say something nice about somebody you know is criticizing you behind your back? Try to say something nice about that person. You'll find your glands will swell up. With his eyes dancing, Jean likes to tell the story of a visitor. A man came to see me when I was director of the L'Arche community. He was a man with many problems, family problems, work problems, and philosophical problems. He was a very sad person. I suppose he was somebody very normal. I don't like the word normal, but if anybody was normal, it was this man. While he was sharing his sadness with me, there was a knock on the door, and before I could answer it, Jean-Claude was in my office and laughing. Some people call Jean-Claude Mongoloid or Down syndrome, but we just call him Jean-Claude. Jean-Claude is a happy man. He likes to come by my office and shake my hand, and that is what he did. He shook my hand and laughed. Then he shook the hand of Mr. Normal and laughed, and then he walked out laughing. And Mr. Normal looked at me and said, "Isn't it sad there are children like that?" Jean's letters also radiate amusement, writing to entertain his community with stories of his travels, of floods, flat tires, and an enormous rat eating an assistant's sandals in India. He finds many ways to explore what creates community. In one talk, he suggests a sense of belonging in a community emerges as we are united both by joy and tears, laughter and crying. This is the heart of communion. I remember 2 corps members in France who came to visit and grieve for their friend who had died. When they hugged him, they were surprised because his body was cold, so they started to laugh. And so the 2 aspects of sadness and laughter in life are united. Now, Jean's central inspiration is that a conscious shift in our thinking is needed to put the most vulnerable at the center. He writes, "There's a beautiful story of a young man with a disability who wanted to win the Special Olympics. He got to the 100-meter race, and he was running like crazy to get that gold medal. One of the others running with him slipped and fell. He turned around and picked him up, and they ran across the finishing line together, last." Are we prepared to sacrifice the prize for solidarity? It's a big question. Do we want to win, or do we want to be in solidarity with others? Why is the gap between the rich and the poor growing, or the gap between the powerful and the powerless? Between those who are oppressors and the oppressed, we have to look at the poorest and the weakest. They have a message to give us. And Jean explores the implications of that. He says the fundamental principle of peace is a belief that each person is important. Even if you cannot speak, even if you cannot walk, even if you've been abandoned, you have a gift to give to the other. I think about this sometimes in wider terms. I think, what decisions about development on Vancouver Island look like if we put the almost extinct Vancouver Island marmot at the center of decision-making? What would the tar sands look like if you put the First Nations children downstream at the center of decision-making? Think about your own community that you live in, your own connections, and think about how decision-making would change if you identified who's most vulnerable here and put them at the center. Now, Jean, in his practical way, spins this out with a unique discussion of meetings. He said, we must always pay attention to the minority who disagrees with a decision or is upset by it. This minority can sometimes be prophetic. It can have a presentiment that something isn't right. Perhaps it says so awkwardly and aggressively, but we should always be attentive to disagreements and give people time to express them in the greatest possible clarity and peace without feeling guilty or that they are being disloyal to the group or to the leader. Jean notes that human beings seem to have a hard time in community. He observes that goldfish seem to manage it, that you rarely see head-on collisions. He wonderfully describes the early stages of joining a community, calling these 3 stages 3 months, though the month may be longer or shorter than a calendar month. He writes, "People who've lived alone normally find their first month in community a great joy. Everyone around them seems to be a saint. Everyone seems so happy. But in the second month, everyone is a devil. Everyone has mixed motives for whatever he does. Everyone is something of a hypocrite. Everyone is so greedy that he takes just that piece of meat I had my eye on. They talk when I want to be silent. And when I want to talk, they cut me off with their long, silent looks. It's a conspiracy. In the third month, they're neither saints nor devils. They're people who have come together to strive and to love. They are people who are growing." When Orbis approached me to do this book, this is a passage I especially wanted to include. Jean says, "I've always wanted to write a book called The Right to be a Rotter. A fairer title is perhaps The Right to be Oneself. One of the greatest difficulties of community life that we sometimes is, he says, that we sometimes force people to be what they're not. We stick an ideal image on them to which they're obliged to conform. But community is not about perfect people. It is about people who are bonded to each other, each of whom is a mixture of good and bad, darkness and light, love and hate. But there can be growth only if we recognize the potential, and this will never unfold if we prevent people from discovering and accepting themselves as they are, with their gifts and their wounds. They have the right to be rotters, to have their own dark places and corners of envy and even hatred in their hearts. We have to learn to accept that and to walk with that without drama and to walk towards liberation." It seemed to me that Jean could have written a book called Eat, Pray, Love, really. Though it might have been distinctly less self-revealing than Elizabeth Gilbert's. But he writes about food. He says food is important and it should be good. Meals shouldn't just be something slopped onto the table. They should be times of communion. This is hard to convey in North America, where meals are often just something you throw into your stomach and have to get through. Certainly Canadians find meals at L'Arche really long. And they are. But the meal is a whole ritual that begins with the soup and goes right through the washing up. Meals shouldn't be serious times. They are times for laughter, because laughter opens people up. And a group which laughs is a group which is relaxed. And when people are relaxed, they can begin to grow together. Nothing grows in hard soil. This is why it is important to have good food and good wine, in France at least. You may have people who squabble over the liturgy or theological problems, but at least let them relax over the food and wine and avoid ulcers. He goes on, "Try to play stupid games. Let us come like children to laugh and enjoy ourselves. This is what community should learn to do, to relax and welcome people. We have a duty to learn more creative ways of celebrating. We need to find more rousing and funnier songs, stories, and snippets of information." And finally, I want to offer an expansion on what Jean said in his letter to me, where he says, "But there is also the silence of being in communion with Jesus." What is the spirit, the interior life that holds it all together for Jean? Well, the first piece is compassion. He wrote, "Some people see religion as the root cause of so much wreckage and conflict. My own feeling that it is not so. At the heart of most, if not all, religions, there is a call to become full of the compassion and goodness of God. Religion can seal us off from others or open us up to them." He writes about forgiveness. He says that the love of one's enemy is at the heart of the Christian message. And when Jesus says, "Love your enemies, do good to those who hate you," he is making a promise of transformation and inner liberation that, if it had been received, would have changed the history of the world. And talking about prayer, Jean writes, we all have to find our own rhythm of prayer. In our deepest selves, below the levels of action and understanding, there is a vulnerable heart, a child who loves but is afraid to love. Silent prayer nourishes this deep place. It is the most important nourishment of all for people who live in community, because it is the most secret and personal. Shortly after his time in hospital at a retreat, Jean said, let us stop running. Let's stop running away from ourselves and from the deepest part of our beings. Let's stop running away from this earth and this beautiful world that is ours. Let's stop running away from each other. Let us simply stop and start listening to our own hearts. There we will touch a lot of pain. We will possibly touch a lot of anger. We will possibly touch a lot of loneliness and anguish. Then we will hear something deeper. We will hear the voice of Jesus. We will hear the voice of God. We will discover that the heart of Christ in some mysterious way is hidden in my heart. And there we will hear, I love you. You are precious to my eyes. And I love you. In November this year, Jean wrote a letter to communities saying, things are changing for me. Before I had a lot of energy, now much less. My legs get tired quickly. I walk more slowly, then stop to sit down and rest. Now at times I sit in my chair, a comfortable one, and I put my hand in the hand of Jesus. Smile at him. He smiles back, just a gentle presence. His heart in mine and mine in his. Nothing glorious. Nothing mystical, no great sentiments, no words. I cannot say that I have said my prayers, no rosary, no psalm recited, nothing accomplished. I am just there with Jesus, and I like being there with him. It is all so simple and gentle and restful. At other times not so restful. I feel lonely and empty inside, nothing to do. It is not so easy to sit there then and wait. Waiting for what? I do not know. My prayer then becomes a little cry. The last words of the Bible become mine. Come, Lord Jesus, come. It is not a cry for the final meeting, just a cry of loneliness, of emptiness, waiting for a moment of peace, waiting for Jesus. If I can repeat over and over again, come, Lord Jesus, come, a little moment of peace comes. The cry becomes a presence. I'm discovering new ways of prayer flowing from life, from my lack of energy, from my very weakness. Well, speaking of which, my mother took a nap this afternoon. Everybody wake up. This is my mother's prophetic word for you. She awoke with an inspiration on how to end this talk. You can thank her after. She pointed out that it's easy to look at Jean's life as intriguing, commendable, far from our own, sort of out there, that it was very good for him and he's really admirable out there. But Jean doesn't think that his life is so different or inaccessible to ours. He says, the future of the world is in the hands of each one of us, and it depends on our commitment together, with others, for peace, each according to our own gifts and responsibilities. Peace is not a question of stopping this or that catastrophe, but of rediscovering a vision, a path of hope for all humanity. Each one of us is called to believe that our small acts of love and hope can help our brothers and sisters, that each gesture has its weight in the balance of love and hate in our world. Thank you.
Thank you indeed. Thank you so much. That was an excellent retelling of a wonderful and amazing life. We want to invite you to join in the dialogue we have, as you'll notice on either side, a microphone for you to bring your questions to, so please do that, and Dr. Whitney-Brown will be happy to participate in a dialogue with you. What struck while you're coming, I'll just give my own little comments because I have a microphone here and nobody's going to shove me out of the way. So while you're coming, you might want to come quickly now so that you can shut me down. But what particularly struck me in your talk is the notion that Jean Vanier's life is so incredibly courageous in that he is willing to do something that so many of us find so very, very difficult, and that is that he's willing to get real. He's willing to be real with people who are real, who are always real, because they can't help themselves. But it seems that we so often are willing to put up our facade and our we are perfect and I have my life together. But Jean Vanier is willing to get real, and that's tough. That's love. Please come. I'll go on to my next comment. No, truly, that was really wonderful. Thank you very much.
Good. And I'm around if you want to talk to me afterwards.
I'm sure we'll have questions.
Good. I talked to the knowledge of ability, and excellent.
Wow.
Good.
Really, no questions? This crowd is really usually so engaged with questions. Are there any comments or questions? If not, I'm going to allow our guest just to rest. Oh, I see a question coming. Thank you.
I find myself wanting more about your own experience at L'Arche and what it was like living in that kind of community. Can you speak to that for a few minutes?
Yeah, I can. I wrote a little memoir about our own time in L'Arche in a book with a purple cover on Chuck's book table back there called Northern Lights, an anthology of Christian spiritual writing in Canada. It's called No Hurry in L'Arche, and it's particularly a kind of short memoir about our time in L'Arche. There are a couple things that I can think of immediately. One is that a peculiar experience of L'Arche is that I found, and I know there's some students here who are going to be going to visit a L'Arche community, that when I moved to L'Arche, I found it, after my rather stimulating life of traveling, really quite tedious initially, and quite boring. And unlike any other job I've ever done, it got less tedious and less boring the longer I was there. Because you get to know people, and the very repetitive jokes get funnier and funnier because you say them every day. And the greetings become part of your heart, and you miss them if you're away from them. So there's something about growing deeper into relationships that really forms you into something different. And I've never had an experience of a place I lived getting deeper and deeper and more fun. So that's one thing that stands out in my mind as a unique experience of L'Arche. The other is that L'Arche has two sides that are, I think, really extraordinary. One is its ability for playfulness. We had so much fun in L'Arche. It is really fun. And the other side of that is that L'Arche really knows how to grieve. And you need to. That people with intellectual disabilities have lived lives of enormous grieving. Of rejection, of being marginalized by society. These are people who've suffered a lot, with a lot of integrity and a lot of courage, usually. And if you're scared of being in front of pain, you'd find it very hard to be in L'Arche. But if you honor the courage of that and aren't afraid of grieving, L'Arche will teach you how to grieve in a really honest and real and wholehearted kind of way. The way we did death was very straightforward. That when someone died, the casket was open, and we'd rumple their hair and pat their hands and straighten their glasses and tuck photos in. It was very grounded, and nothing was very spooky. Life was not spooky. Bodily functions, all the stuff of being human was kind of right out there in a very unflinching kind of way, including death. And that was, I think, quite healing and quite transformative to me, and very good for me as I started to be a parent. Our 3 children were all born in those L'Arche years, and it was extremely good for me in becoming a parent. How about that? Is that? Yeah.
Hi, Carrie. I'm sort of sad and scared about the end of Jean's life, and I can't formulate that into a question, but and it seems ridiculous to ask for a word of reassurance or something, but can you, what do you think will happen to L'Arche after Jean is gone?
It's a very good question. I was actually at some meetings where we were just talking about that in Atlanta last month a little bit. I don't know. Actually, there are people here who live in L'Arche who might have other ideas, but I don't know. As far as a founder can, Jean's worked very hard at, as you know, at making L'Arche really sustainable, of withdrawing himself from leadership, of making sure the structures carry on without him. But it's also true that he there's nothing he can do about the fact that he holds the spirit of L'Arche in its founding. And I think when he dies, it's going to leave a tremendous hole. But I think something else will happen. I think maybe other people will start to speak differently about L'Arche. I think maybe something new will develop that we didn't know was being held back by Jean even. I really think that might be true. That's often true and found in communities. When I tried to write about Jean Vanier, I found it actually very difficult. I'd been writing about Henri Nouwen, and Henri is really easy to write about. If you know anything about Henri Nouwen, his light side and his dark side were just right out there. It was like a photograph with all the contrast right there for you. And when I tried to write about Jean, I felt like I was trying to write about an overexposed photograph that was sort of too bright. It was very hard to find, not exactly his shadow, but the contrasts in him. And I started to wonder a little bit, what does that I can't find that, or that it's so hard to articulate, what does that mean in terms of the communities he's founded? And that gives me a little bit of an inkling that perhaps in a post-live Jean L'Arche world, that something new will grow that it hasn't quite been able to. We'll lose a lot, but I think something new will be given. The history of L'Arche is that there's always something given. Ask me in 10 years.
Yeah. Hi there. What do you think? It occurs to me that the experience of L'Arche and what's been written about L'Arche and so on and so forth might have broader implications for how we treat our children than if you happen to be an assistant at L'Arche. I'm wondering, can you expound upon the vulnerability of our little people and what we can learn from our little people and what we're losing in not being attentive to our little people, our young children?
As a parent, you always have curiosity of what they're going to be when they grow up and where they're headed. Yeah? And I think one of the things that you learn in L'Arche is that this moment is it. So I think as parents, that's huge, that this moment is it, that this moment with my child is the important one. I mean, whether that reveals something of what's coming, of how they're going to grow, of what their vocation is in life, is curious, but there's something about the wisdom of L'Arche that takes you right back to the present moment. Yeah? That the gift that they are offering is their fully human gift, as human and full as yours, and it's being given now. So that's the first thing that comes to mind. And children are very vulnerable. And it's easy to miss that. So again, putting the weakest or most vulnerable at the middle and noticing that. Just don't miss it, that their vulnerabilities matter. Our lives go on with great momentum sometimes, and it's really hard to slow them down and be really present. I think those are things I learned in L'Arche. The other thing in L'Arche was just the simplicity of play, that play is really fun. Don't miss it. I'm sorry, I don't feel like this is a very good answer, but those are the things that are coming to my mind. Yeah.
How could we learn from L'Arche to help our street people and the marginalized out there, the really poor? Could we?
Well, I went from L'Arche to visiting people in boarding houses in Toronto, which is sort of one stage up from shelters. And it was a really, really sad, angry, anguished group of people living in really, really difficult circumstances. And I think what I brought there from L'Arche, what helped me was truly believing that everyone's life mattered and that everyone's gift mattered. Jean Vanier's sense of Aristotle is that for everyone to become accomplished matters in the world, that if someone's gift isn't lived out in the world, we all lose out. And I carried that with me to these boarding houses, to just really hold in mind that everyone there had a gift to offer the world, and that everyone needs to know they can create something beautiful in the world, that they have something to do in the world, and to actually believe that and then help people find their moment, their moment of poetry, their moment of art, their moment of kindness, their moment of vulnerability, whatever that moment is, to help them to take courage and find it, to be truthful about their lives. What I found, too, was that, I don't want to make stereotypes, but certainly what I found in Toronto was that among people with the kinds of mental illness and addictions that I was getting to know, that there were a tremendous number of artists. There were poets and writers and artists. You can speculate in all kinds of ways why that's true, but they were people with an awful lot to offer, and a lot of wisdom in them. So I think one thing is simply to truly believe that, and then to know that that's true, and then to think, how do we create a society where everyone's gift can be received? It's like Mr. Normal. The problem isn't with Jean-Claude. The problem is that Mr. Normal is blind to his beauty. And our society, the problem with a lot of people isn't what it would seem. The problem is that our society doesn't know how to welcome the diversity of people in the world.
I couldn't resist, Carolyn, just to try and build on that point of homelessness and poverty in the downtown.
I was looking longingly at you, thinking, say something to me. Yeah.
And for sure, from the Working Center's perspective, or St. John's Kitchen, the ideas of Jean Vanier were kind of core to what we were thinking about back in, say, even 1977, 78, reading Jean Vanier's books, Followers of Christ and Followers of Jesus, and living in community and growth. Community and growth. Together, yeah. Really important books, but that taught a lot about what it is to do service at the very bottom of society. And I think one of the things that the Working Center has tried to do the most is build community. So it's not really about providing services. And people love to impose on us the concept that we're providing services to people. But in fact, the Working Center is just one big community. And the community is quite large, probably, 1,000, 1,500 people living kind of in a different spirit than L'Arche, because it's not people all living together, but living in apartments, serving food, fixing bikes, fixing computers, having a cafe, helping people find jobs. But it's this wide community of people that serve each other. And what we've learned the most is that individuals, especially, whether with we don't even have words at the Working Center to describe it. People who might not be in the regular labor force, we might say, they're our hardest worker. They're the people who do all the work within the working center. There are a whole bunch of people that are paid, but there's a whole bunch of people that give everything they have to serve others in all kinds of work. And it's a community of people that do that. So I think there is there's little pockets of Jean Vanier's ideas that take hold. So that's one way of answering that.
Excellent. Does everyone know?
That's not really a question, of course. That was just a little.
Does everyone know the Working Center in Kitchener? An extraordinary place of just all sorts of life and energy and experiments and creativity. Yeah. If you don't, go find Joe there and his family. They can all talk to you about it. Good. I think we're done. Thank you all.
Thank you. Once again, I was just reminded of one little anecdote that I'll tell you. I worked for a number of years in a group home. It wasn't a large community. It was a group home. It was a Christian home for people with different levels of abilities. And there was one young girl in that home who I really loved. Her name was Michelle, and she would have been about 7 years old, and she was a rascal. And she would sometimes hide when new people would come to the home. She would hide behind the couch, and she would give the most devilish little laugh, and she would scare people. And she would sit back there and she would do this funny little laugh, and then she would hide, and they wouldn't know where this little laugh had come from, and they would be looking like this. They would be all concerned. But she was very sensitive to sounds and lights, and she was a rascal, and she would get very angry, and she would grab hold of you and not let go, and she would sometimes cut your skin with her nails when she would be very anxious. But Michelle loved music, and she loved to be held close to your body. She loved it. And so sometimes she would just stand, and she would hold on to me, and we would just rock back and forth to music, and we would do that for 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, and she would calm down. But what's interesting about Michelle was that she was legally blind, and she only had a few words that she could say, and when she'd see you, she would sing your voice because she loved music. And so when she'd see me, she'd say, "Hi, Joanne. Hi, Joanne." And that's how she'd greet me. And several years after I left that group home, I worked as a substitute teacher in a school. And one day I walked into a room, and there on the top of a table like this one was a young teenager, standing on the top of the table, singing and dancing and refusing to come down as two young teaching assistants said, "What should we do? How do we get her down? What do we do?" In a complete and total panic. And I walked into this room and I said, "Hi, Michelle." And she turned, and she was legally blind. She couldn't see me. She didn't know me, hadn't seen me for a number of years. And she said, "Hi, Joanne." And she got down and she gave me a hug, and she stood and she sang with me. She rocked back and forth. And that really, to me, is what I think of when you tell your stories. It's about that human connection. We have no idea what it really means sometimes. We really have no idea. So now I would like to invite our own Dr. Perrin to just close our evening for us, and we'll go from there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Joanne, and a very, very generous thank you to all of you this evening for coming out to hear Dr. Carolyn Whitney-Brown. What a pleasure it is to see you all, to participate in the lecture series, and Joanne's doing just an excellent job bringing all of this together. Joanne, thank you so very much for another very successful evening with all of our friends here gathered. Carolyn, you brought such wisdom to our community this evening. You began, I thought, on a rather risky note, talking about Andy Warhol. Just a very few weeks ago, and that building was filled with a monkey display. Goodman's displays. However, the irony of those two sequences are not lost on your thought. You began talking to us about Warhol's experiments with social equals, his famous phrase, equal and welcome, and experiment in democracy. Warhol experimented, and I think for me that was the link and the segue into Vanier's reflection that you began so well. Experiments indeed are tricky things. You know, experiments can go bad. Experiments can go bad. They can turn our world upside down. They can open our world up to new directions that we would not have anticipated nor desired. They can be openings to new perspectives, but they can close down our thought as well. I think this is the kind of risky experiment that you spoke to this evening in relationship to Jean Vanier and that courageous step he took in the mid-60s in Trolleybroy outside of Paris. His risky experiment must have been filled with all of the above, these vast unknowns, these vast risks that seemed perhaps so simple at the time, but did not play out that way. He moved into a small nondescript village, but that village became the world. He entered and grew into a simple lifestyle that became the lifestyle of hundreds of thousands of people. And so, Carolyn, I think you've helped us understand tonight, and I want to speak to our young people, especially that are here from our Beyond Borders programs and our other students. You helped us understand how experiences in youth, as Jean Vanier's did, can shape us for life and lead us into risky adventures. All of you young and courageous people here tonight, these words of Jean Vanier should not be lost on you, nor his experiment so early in his youth. But you've also helped us understand how intellectual inquiry can take us into these new worlds. It's no simple thing, Aristotle's understanding of happiness. No simple thing, but profound as the ocean is deep. And so you've reminded us once again of God's mysterious presence in our lives, how that presence invades, it disrupts, it disorients, and in that way grace enters. Through the discontinuity of our lives, as Carolyn has so well described, the discontinuity in so many ways of Jean Vanier's life. Those first simple steps, the vast unknown, an example to us all, and thank you so much for reminding us again of this tremendous richness.
Well, as always, it has been my pleasure to host the evening. I love seeing you here. I'm glad you continue to come out, and I hope that you will continue to come out. And in that note, I'll just remind you that there are 2 lectures remaining in our 2008-2009 series. The first of those is Mark Juergensmeyer, which was not on our brochure, but is a very good event that you really should come and see. He will be talking about religious challenges to the secular state. And that is on Monday, April 6th, at 7:30, so mark that in your calendars, and hopefully you'll be able to come out. He's one of the leading scholars on religious violence in the modern world, a very interesting speaker and scholar. So that's one to mark, and the other is the annual Sweeney Lecture on Multicultural Healthcare, and that will be a panel, and that should be a very interesting one as well. That's on April the 26th at St. Mary's Hospital. And we will have a number of people who are dealing with new issues that are rising in our very multicultural and multi-religious society as we try to deliver respectful health care to those people. And then the final thing I wanted to just make you aware of, it's not a center lecture, but it is an event that you might find interesting, and that is the Canadian Forum on Theology and Education, who will have Father Dermot O'Murchu here on May the 7th. At 8 p.m. if you're interested in that. He will be speaking on adult faith development and developing a relationship with God that is more co-creative than perhaps the traditional models have encouraged us to think about before. So those are some interesting things that are coming ahead. Please mark them on your calendar. We'll be sending out information, so if you're on our mailing list, you'll get that. But I really look forward to seeing you then, and until then, enjoy the spring. Long may it last. See you.